Patricia's last stand. The mother who froze everything to prove she was still standing. When Patricia Calloway froze every bank account, every investment, and every insurance policy she owned in a single afternoon, her son David called the police, and that was the second worst mistake he ever made with his mother. But before any of that happened, before the phone calls and the lawyers, and the silence that would swallow an entire family whole, there was just a woman in a yellow house on a quiet street in Medford, Oregon. A 74-year-old retired schoolteacher who had lived in the same home she and her late husband Raymond had built together 41 years ago. She tended her garden, paid her bills on time, volunteered at the local library every Thursday, and never once asked her children for help until the day her eldest son, David, sat her down at her own kitchen table and told her it was time to move into a nursing home. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what Patricia did and why, you have to understand who she was before the world tried to take everything from her. Patricia's mornings began the same way they had for nearly a decade. She woke at 6:15 without an alarm, brewed 1 cup of black coffee in a ceramic mug Raymond had given her on their 30th anniversary, and walked out the front door by 7. Her route never changed. She followed the paved path along Bear Creek, past the dog park where she nodded at the same 3 walkers she had never exchanged more than a dozen words with, past the wooden bench where she sometimes sat to watch the water move, and back home before 8. It was not exercise. It was ritual. It was proof to herself every single morning that her legs still worked, that her mind still mapped the world correctly, and that she did not need anyone to tell her when to wake up or where to go. Her garden was her cathedral. Raymond had planted the roses along the south fence the year they moved in, and Patricia had kept every last one of them alive through drought and frost and grief. She weeded on her hands and knees. She pruned with shears, she sharpened herself. Neighbors sometimes slowed their cars to admire the roses from the street, and Patricia would catch them looking and feel something close to pride, though she would never have called it that. Every Tuesday at 4 o'clock, she called her younger daughter Sarah, who lived in Boise. The conversations lasted exactly 20 minutes and covered weather, grandchildren, and whatever recipe Patricia had tried that week. Every Thursday, she drove herself to the Jackson County Library and spent 3 hours shelving returned books in the fiction section. The librarians loved her. She never complained, never gossiped, and always stayed 10 minutes past her shift to straighten the chairs in the reading room. Financially, Patricia was more stable than most people half her age. 32 years of teaching had earned her a modest but reliable pension. The house was paid off, had been for over a decade, and there was a savings account she had never touched, not once, because Raymond would have wanted it left alone for emergencies. She balanced her checkbook by hand on the 1st of every month. She had never missed a property tax payment in her life. What Patricia did not talk about, what she never talked about, was the weight she carried. Raymond had died 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came in March. He was gone by August, and Patricia had stood at his graveside in a black dress she later donated to Goodwill because she could not bear to see it hanging in the closet. She never spoke about the loss, not to Sarah, not to David, not to the grief counselor the hospital had recommended. Instead, she poured everything into routine, into discipline, into the quiet, fierce architecture of a life that did not need anyone else to hold it up. But there were cracks, small ones, the kind only someone looking for them would notice. A fall in the bathroom one November morning that left a bruise on her hip she told no one about. A missed doctor's appointment she blamed on a calendar error. A growing stack of unopened mail on the hallway table, bills she had always opened the day they arrived, now sitting untouched for a week, sometimes 2. Alone, each of these things meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern. And when David drove down from Portland for a rare weekend visit that spring, he saw them all at once. David had always considered himself the responsible one in the family, and in many ways he was. But responsibility without understanding is a dangerous thing. And what he did next would fracture something that took decades to build. David Calloway was 49 years old, a project manager at a mid-size engineering firm in Portland, married to a woman named Janine, father to 2 teenagers who needed rides to practice and help with college essays. He was a man who lived by timelines, deliverables, and risk assessments. He loved his mother, that was never the question. But he loved her the way busy people love from a distance, in summaries, in check-ins, in the weight of worry that sits just below the surface of an ordinary week. He drove down to Medford every 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes less, and each visit had become a quiet audit he never admitted he was conducting. The bruise on Patricia's hip that she tried to cover with a longer blouse, he saw it. The carton of milk in the refrigerator 3 days past its expiration, he noticed. The gas burner on the stove left on low. A pale blue flame barely visible beneath a cold pot. He stood in the kitchen doorway and felt his stomach drop. Back in Portland, he mentioned these things to a colleague named Rick, whose mother had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 2 years prior. Rick told him the hardest part was waiting too long, and those words lodged somewhere deep in David's chest and would not leave. So he made a decision. He did not call Patricia first. He did not ask her how she was feeling or whether she had concerns of her own. He did not sit with the discomfort long enough to wonder whether what he had seen was a pattern or simply the ordinary texture of aging. Instead, he drove to Medford on a Saturday morning in late April, with a manila folder on the passenger seat. Inside were printed brochures for 3 assisted living facilities, 2 in the Rogue Valley, 1 closer to Portland. He had highlighted amenities. He had compared monthly costs. He had prepared for this the way he prepared for everything, with data, with options. With the calm confidence of a man who believed he was solving a problem. He found Patricia in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had graded thousands of student papers over 30 years. The same table where she had helped him with long division and listened to him practice his 8th grade graduation speech. He sat down across from her and placed the folder between them and said, "Mom, I think it's time we talked about your next chapter." Patricia looked at the folder. She looked at her son. And what she heard was not what he said. What she heard was something far older and far more devastating. She heard, "Mom, you are no longer capable of writing your own story." She did not yell, not at first. She asked him very quietly whether Sarah knew about this. David hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. He admitted he hadn't told his sister because, in his words, "Sarah gets too emotional." And in that single sentence, the wound doubled. Patricia was not just being managed, she was being managed in secret by one child who thought he knew best and who had excluded the other for the crime of feeling too much. The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. And then Patricia's voice rose in a way David had not heard since he was a boy. She told him she had lived in that house for 41 years. She told him she had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and navigated a grief that almost swallowed her whole, all from within those walls. David tried to respond with statistics. He cited numbers about elderly falls, about kitchen fires in single-occupant homes, about the average decline timeline for women over 70 living alone. Each fact landed like a stone thrown at glass. Patricia stood up from the table, pointed to the front door, and said words her son would remember for the rest of his life. "I buried your father from this house, and I will not be carried out of it by my own son." David left that afternoon. He drove the 4.5 hours back to Portland, with the manila folder still sitting on Patricia's kitchen table untouched. He told Janine that his mother was upset, but that she would calm down and come around. He believed this, because he had never truly studied the woman who raised him. Patricia Calloway had never once in her life calmed down and come around. She had only ever calmed down and made a plan. 3 days, that is all it took. 3 days of silence from David. 3 days of sitting alone in that house with the manila folder still on her kitchen table, like a declaration of war she never asked for. And in those 3 days, Patricia Calloway did not cry. She did not call her friends to vent. She did not pour herself wine and stare out the window wondering where things went wrong. She made a plan, and on the morning of that 3rd day, she put it into motion. Patricia drove herself to First Interstate Bank in downtown Medford. She chose her outfit deliberately, the good navy blazer, the one she had always saved for parent-teacher conferences and meetings where she needed people to take her seriously. She carried a leather folder under her arm, the one Raymond had given her for their 20th anniversary, and inside it she had organized every financial document she owned, account numbers, policy information, beneficiary forms, contact lists. She had spent the previous evening laying it all out on the dining room table, sorting through decades of paperwork with the patience of someone building a case. And in a way, she was. She requested a meeting with the branch manager, not a teller, not a customer service representative, the branch manager. And when she sat down across from him, Patricia spoke clearly and without hesitation. She wanted to freeze her checking account. She wanted to freeze her savings account. She wanted to freeze her money market fund. The manager asked if everything was all right, and Patricia smiled and said everything was fine. She was simply taking precautions. But she was not finished. From the bank, she contacted her insurance provider and placed a hold on her life insurance policy. She called her financial advisor, a man named Gerald, who had managed the family's modest investments since Raymond was alive, and instructed him to lock her portfolio. No withdrawals, no transfers, no changes of any kind without her written, notarized consent. Then she went one step further. She changed the beneficiary designations on every account she controlled, restructuring them so that no one, not David, not anyone, could make a single decision about her finances without her explicit, documented approval. Every move she made that day was legal. Every move was precise. And every move was designed to send a single, unmistakable message: I am still here, and I am still in charge. David discovered what had happened 5 days later when a recurring transfer he had set up months ago to cover Patricia's lawn service was declined. He called the bank, confused at first, then alarmed. The representative on the other end told him politely but firmly that he had no authority over the accounts in question. He called Patricia immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. And then she said the words that would echo through the family for years. "If I am competent enough to freeze everything I own in one afternoon, David, then I am competent enough to live in my own home." David called his sister next. Sarah, living in Sacramento with her husband and 2 teenage daughters, learned about the nursing home conversation and the frozen accounts in one breathless, panicked phone call. And she was furious, but not at Patricia. She was furious at David for acting alone, for ambushing their mother, for never once picking up the phone to say, "I am worried about Mom. What do you think we should do?" The sibling rift did not build slowly. It cracked open in a single afternoon. Within 48 hours, Sarah had booked a flight from Sacramento to Medford. She did not call David to coordinate. She went straight to her mother's house, sat down at the same kitchen table where the manila folder had once been, and asked Patricia to tell her everything from the beginning. But Patricia's power move, as decisive and as satisfying as it must have felt, did not solve the problem underneath, because the problem was never really about bank accounts or nursing homes. It was about a family that had forgotten how to talk to each other without an agenda, without a solution already drafted, without someone walking in the door having already decided what was best. And that kind of forgetting does not reverse itself just because one person draws a line in the sand. There were truths living inside that house that no one had the language for. Not because the Callaways were unkind people, but because the things that hurt the most are usually the things we bury the deepest. And this family had been burying for years. David never told anyone about the night he found his father. Not Sarah. Not his wife. Not the grief counselor the hospital suggested he see. It was a Tuesday late, almost 11. He had stopped by the house to drop off a bag of groceries because Patricia had mentioned she was low on coffee. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual. The living room was dark. He called out, and no one answered. He found Raymond on the bathroom floor, unconscious, his body folded against the base of the tub at an angle that did not look survivable. And David did not immediately call 911. He sat down on that cold tile floor, pulled his father's head into his lap, and stayed there. He does not know how long, minutes, 2, maybe 10, maybe longer. He just held him and listened to his own breathing and thought, not yet, not yet. When he finally made the call, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely press the number. That was the stroke that preceded the cancer diagnosis. And everything after at the hospitals, the hospice conversations, the funeral David walked through like a man who had already seen the worst thing and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. So when he sat at Patricia's kitchen table with that manila folder, he was not being cruel. He was not trying to take his mother's life away. He was trying to prevent himself from walking into another room in that house and finding another parent on the ground, alone, with no one there to hold them. His urgency looked like control, but underneath it was the purest kind of terror. And Sarah carried her own weight, though she carried it from 6 hours away. When she took the promotion in Sacramento 3 years ago, she promised Patricia she would visit every month. The first few months she did. Then the visits became every other month. Then every quarter. She sent flowers on birthdays. She called on Tuesdays, always Tuesdays, because routine made it feel like enough. But she knew it was not enough, and Patricia knew. They both knew, and neither said it, because saying it would mean admitting that distance had become a kind of permission. Permission to not fully engage. Permission to love from a safe remove where you never had to see the slow changes, the slight tremor in the hands, the way the garden grew, a little wilder each season, the stack of unopened mail on the counter. When Sarah flew to Medford and raged at David, part of that rage was real and justified, but part of it, the sharpest part, the part that made her voice crack, was aimed at herself, And then there was Patricia. Patricia, who was not afraid of dying. She had watched Raymond die, and she understood that death, while terrible, was at least definitive. What terrified her was something far more corrosive: irrelevance. She had spent 32 years standing in front of classrooms, shaping minds, watching children become people. And when she retired, the silence that followed was deafening. No one needed her explanations anymore. No one raised a hand. Raymond's death magnified that silence into something unbearable. So the house, the garden, the Tuesday shifts at the Medford Library, these were not hobbies. They were proof. Proof that she still mattered, that she still occupied space in the world that would be noticed if she vacated it. A nursing home, to Patricia, was not a building with medical staff and scheduled meals. It was a verdict, a final ruling that the proof no longer counted. She came from a generation that equated asking for help with admitting defeat. Her own mother, a farmer's wife in Klamath Falls, had worked the land until her knees gave out, and even then she crawled to the barn to feed the animals. Patricia grew up watching that, and she inherited the belief deep in her bones, beyond the reach of logic, that usefulness was the price of dignity, that you earned your place at the table by what you could still do, not by who you had been. Every member of this family was in pain. Every one of them was acting out of love, and not one of them could see the others clearly enough to say so. It took an unexpected visitor, someone outside the family entirely, to crack open what the Callaways could not crack open themselves. Her name was Margaret Chen. She had retired from 30 years of social work in Jackson County, and she had spent the last decade volunteering at the Medford Public Library, where she and Patricia had become the kind of friends who didn't need to explain themselves to each other. Margaret had watched the whole thing unfold: the frozen accounts, the phone calls, the silence between mother and son, and she had said nothing, because she knew that unsolicited advice was just another form of control. But when Patricia stopped showing up to their Wednesday morning book group, Margaret decided it was time. She didn't call David. She didn't call Sarah. She called all three of them separately, and she invited them to dinner at her house on a Friday evening, neutral ground. No one's kitchen table, no one's territory. Just Margaret's small dining room with the blue curtains and the mismatched chairs, and a pot of chicken soup that she had been making the same way for 40 years. They came. That alone was remarkable. David drove down from Portland. Sarah flew in from Denver. Patricia walked across the street, because Margaret lived 4 houses away, and she wore the gray cardigan she always wore when she was nervous. They sat down, and for the first few minutes, no one said much of anything. The soup was good. The bread was warm. And then Margaret, who had spent 3 decades sitting across from families in crisis, asked the only question that mattered. What are each of you most afraid of right now? Not what do you want, not what do you think is best. What are you afraid of? David answered first, and his voice cracked before he finished the sentence. He said he was terrified of getting a phone call in the middle of the night. The kind of call that begins with silence on the other end, or with a stranger's voice asking if he is next of kin. He said he had been rehearsing that call in his head for 2 years, and it had turned him into someone he didn't recognize, someone who looked at his own mother and saw only risk. Sarah went next. She said she was terrified that she had already missed too much to matter. That by choosing Denver, by choosing her career, by choosing distance, she had forfeited the right to have a voice in her mother's life. She said she didn't push harder, not because she didn't care, but because she wasn't sure she had earned the standing to care. And then Patricia spoke. She said she was terrified that if she left her house, Raymond would truly be gone, because every room still held a piece of him. The dent in the hallway wall where he had carried the Christmas tree in sideways every December. The pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where he had measured the children's height each birthday. The chair by the window where he had read the newspaper every morning for 41 years, and where she still set a cup of coffee some days before she caught herself. She was not holding on to a house. She was holding on to the last physical evidence that her life with him had been real. For the first time, the conversation was not about logistics. It was not about liability or brochures or what the neighbors might think. It was about grief and identity, and love expressed so clumsily that it had become unrecognizable even to the people who felt it most. David cried at that table. Not quietly, not politely. He put his head in his hands and wept the way he hadn't wept since his father's funeral. And Patricia, this woman who had frozen every account and locked every door, reached across Margaret's mismatched table and took her son's hand. It was the first physical affection between them in years. Neither of them pulled away. What they built that evening was not a grand solution. It was a middle-path imperfect human full of compromise. Sarah would restructure her remote work schedule to spend 1 week each month in Medford. David would stop consulting strangers about his mother's future and start consulting his mother. And Patricia, this was the hardest part. Patricia agreed to a medical alert system, a weekly check-in with her doctor, and help with the things that had genuinely become difficult, the high shelves she could no longer reach safely, the icy front steps that turned treacherous every winter. She would accept help not because she was broken, but because accepting help from people who love you is not the same thing as surrender. Patricia unfroze the accounts the following Monday. She walked into the credit union in downtown Medford, signed the paperwork, and restored every name she had removed. She wore the navy blazer again, the one she had worn when she first marched in to freeze them. The same teller helped her. Neither of them mentioned the irony. Patricia's story could end there, and it would be a good ending. A family broken apart by fear, pulled back together by the simplest of questions asked by the right person at the right time. But the real lesson of this story is not in how it ended. It is in what it teaches every family that will one day face the same kitchen table conversation or the same silence where that conversation should have been. So what did Patricia Calloway teach us? Not with a lecture, not with a lesson plan, but with a frozen bank account and a navy blazer, and the kind of quiet fury that only a woman who has buried a husband and raised 3 children and kept her roses alive through 30 Oregon winters could summon. She taught us first that you should never open a conversation about someone's future without first honoring their past. David walked into that kitchen with brochures. He came armed with statistics and floor plans and monthly rates. But he never once sat down across from his mother and asked the only question that actually mattered. 5 words. They cost nothing. They require no spreadsheet, no research, no appointment with a financial advisor. And yet those 5 words, spoken with genuine curiosity rather than prepackaged concern, might have changed the entire trajectory of what followed. When we skip the asking and go straight to the solving, we tell the people we love that their experience of their own life matters less than our interpretation of it. And that is a wound that does not heal easily. She taught us, second, that fear is a shapeshifter. It disguises itself as practicality. David's numbers were real. The statistics about falls, about kitchen fires, about elderly people living alone, none of that was fabricated. But the spreadsheets were armor. They were the acceptable, rational packaging around a feeling he had never allowed himself to sit with the raw, unprocessed terror of losing his mother the way he had already lost his father. When we make decisions for the people we love based on our own unexamined fear, we are not caring for them. We are managing our own anxiety at their expense. And we dress it up so convincingly that we believe our own performance. She taught us, third, that independence and needing help are not opposites. This was Patricia's lesson to learn about herself, and it was smaller than David's but equally real. She had spent so many years building a fortress of self-sufficiency that even reasonable support felt like an invasion. A handrail by the back steps is not a white flag. A weekly check-in call is not surveillance. Accepting a helping hand on an icy morning does not erase 60 years of standing on your own. The strongest people are not those who never need anything from anyone. They are those who can receive help without losing the thread of who they are. And she taught us, finally, that the family conversation about aging must happen before the crisis, not during it. The Calloways waited. They waited until bruises and burnt burners and a pile of unopened mail forced the issue. And by then everyone was too scared and too defensive to hear each other clearly. Every family will face this conversation, every single one, and the ones who navigate it with grace will be the families who began it early, gently, and repeatedly, not as an interrogation or an intervention, but as an ongoing act of love spoken in a language the other person can actually hear. Patricia Calloway is still in her yellow house in Medford. The roses are still blooming along the fence. She still volunteers at the food bank on Thursdays, and she still makes the lemon bars from scratch. On the hallway table where the unopened mail once piled up, there is now a framed photograph of the whole family, gathered around Margaret Chen's dinner table, the night they finally stopped talking at each other and started talking to each other. Her story was never really about money. It was never about revenge or stubbornness or a woman refusing to face reality. It was a mother's desperate, dignified cry to be seen as a whole person, not a problem to be managed, not a risk to be mitigated, but a human being still standing, still capable, still here. And in that, Patricia's story becomes a mirror for every family navigating the painful, sacred intersection of aging, autonomy, and love.